Banlist is out, Worlds is over, so a brand new format is finally upon us. Hey guys, Otak here, back with another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh video, and I didn't really want to do a tier list video because the format hasn't changed a whole lot, or at least I didn't think it was going to. But the Forbidden Limited list really brought down the power level of a handful of decks in the current format, and until Rage of Abyss comes out, honestly, the format's kind of in an interesting spot. I'm sure many of you are probably wanting me to talk about the bullshit that went down at the World Championship, but quite frankly, I don't care. So with all that being said, let's just jump right on into the tier list. But first, I have noticed that a great deal of you, about 80%, are not currently subscribed to the channel, and if you like competitive Yu-Gi-Oh content, consider supporting the channel so I can continue to make videos like this one. Alright, so here are the tiers. We have the best deck. There's going to be one deck in this tier, and funny enough, it is not going to be Fiendsmith Snake Eye. We have tier 1. These are the decks that are going to pretty much be at the top tables all the time, minus the best deck, which will, of course, be the best deck. Meta contenders, these are decks that can definitely pinch out a topping at a YCS, which I think we only have one until Rage of Abyss. But also, these are decks that'll do very well at regional levels, and also probably very well at locals. We have rogues that will have to earn their spot at topping regionals, may pinch out a topping at a YCS, and then they are probably doing very well at locals because locals is a very diverse format. And then, of course, we have Dogwater. These are decks you should not play for the current format, probably ever again, who knows. But we, of course, are going to talk about the biggest elephant in the room, and that is Fiendsmith Snake Eye. Like I said, it is not going to be the best deck in the room currently. Fiendsmith Snake Eye, funny enough, we all kind of kept saying that limiting Snake Eye Ash and limiting Poplar, or just limits in general, was not going to do much to the deck, and it kind of hasn't. The thing about this deck is that in its current state, pre-Rage of Abyss, the deck is actually brought down quite a bit. The deck having lost the Lacrima means they can't burn for time in a long, grinded out game, but also having lost Beatrice means they just can't really auto-search off of Fiendsmith cards to get to the Snake Eye cards without even committing a normal summon. So there's that, but then also with Snake Eye Ash and Poplar being put to 1, Poplar being opened is a very just feels bad feeling that you'll have to do a weird combo line to be able to get to the add effect off of it, but also just having your Ash get hit with a Ash, essentially, is also feels bad. But the builds are kind of compensating, trying to throw in like 2 Snake Eye Oak or even a Birch I have seen some builds running around with. But overall, the best cards in the deck, of course, are Ash and Poplar in terms of the bodies, and being able to just prevent those from re-hitting the board is very good because it kind of kills the grind game of Snake Eye quite a bit. But the deck is also trying to just auto win turn 1 now. I've seen some builds, and I'll talk about this in a video later this week. There are builds running Vanity's Fiend. They are essentially using the Fiendsmith engine to use Aerial Eater to dump the Vanity's Fiend and then make M7, add it back to hand, and because they don't really commit a normal summon anymore, they just tribute summon into Vanity's Fiend, and their end board is usually like Vanity's Fiend, Flame Burst, IP in the back row, and then, you know, the usual. But there are also builds that are trying to Griffin lock you, so there are a lot of builds trying to make up for the lack of cards. But currently they are just kind of biding their time, because when the Azamina cards come out in Rage of the Abyss, this once again will be the best deck in the room. But until then, it is safe to say that Yubel Fiendsmith is the best deck in the room. This deck puts up some crazy end boards with 2 Phantom of Yubel usually, a Varudris, Nightmare Pain, Nightmare Throne, and then like probably just a handful of other shit, Imperms possibly. This deck is setting up a very strong end board, and then also going second is a hard thing to do because they don't really have to crack a board. They just have to put like 3 monsters on the board and swing into a 3k monster with Nightmare Pain in the back row. They're not really having to commit too much. Now, with opening the Spirit Gates put to 1, it has brought down the power level of this deck a little bit. However, there are just 1,000 different openers for the deck, so it's not like they absolutely needed it. It's just one less pop that they're kind of getting off. And then also on top of that, this deck is, of course, very exposed to too many forms of interaction. The deck kind of loses to Nib, which is why they have Phantom of Yubel hitting the board usually on like summon 2 if they can, summon 3 most likely, so they can avoid Nib. But also just too many forms of interaction in general really just kills this deck and kind of makes them pass. So it is, of course, the best deck in the room in a lot of people's opinions, myself included, but it is still very manageable to play against. And the last deck I want to talk about relating to like the best decks as of the last year is Fire King Snake Eye. I actually personally think the Fire King Snake Eye build is better than the Fiendsmith build, but that is, again, just my opinion. This deck just being able to have that resource grind with the Garunix, the Ponix. The issue, of course, is that the Fire King cards are, of course, bricks if you open too many of them, or you open the wrong combination of them, along with the wrong combination of Snake Eye cards, which was always the problem from the start. But that's it for the 3 top dogs of the format. These have been the biggest problem decks of the format for like the last 6 months. We're pretty tired of talking about them. We're pretty tired of seeing them, but that is it for them. We're going to move on to the actual decks that I'm sure a lot of us really want to talk about. The first one being is a deck very close to my heart, which is Branded. Branded lost 2 Branded Fusion, but they got 1 Grass. The thing about Branded is that it is one of the few decks in the format that was already running 60 cards without Grass, and now that they have 2 open slots, they can fit 1 Grass is Greener and 1 of another card. Not to mention, on top of that, there are many, many, many games that Branded wins without resolving Branded Fusion from the start. It is, of course, night and day that if a Branded player opens Branded Fusion, that it will change the outcome of the game heavily, but there are just a lot of end boards from Branded that never once activated Branded Fusion or just didn't resolve it because of Ash Blossom. And on top of that, the Gimmick Puppet, Nightmare, and the Sanctifier are still very live, so because of that, I still have to put this in tier 1. Branded is still very much doing Branded things, and with Grass is Greener in the deck, and the deck's already running Thrust, so like they already have ways to find it. This deck is just made for Grass is Greener, and it will most certainly still see success because of it. Next is Centurion. This is Centurion Pure or Centurion White Woods. It really doesn't matter. I think they're both kind of the same power level. White Forest kind of gives it a little bit more of a power spike, but at the current moment, Centurion kind of isn't like that great. I'm going to put it down in Rogue simply because the deck having lost Calamity means that it brought down its power level quite significantly, and because of this, the deck doesn't really have a lot. But the deck is getting some amazing support in Rage of the Abyss, which means that the deck will kind of jump up in the power level once again once that comes out. But until then, I kind of have to put the Centurion in the Rogue category. Now let's talk about Chimera, shall we? For anyone who has been subscribed to the channel or just been seeing my videos as of the last little while, you will know that I am very, very interested in Chimera. It is one of, if not my favorite deck of all time. It just does a lot of really cool stuff, and with the Fiendsmith stuff having come out in Infinite Forbidden, the deck does a lot of even cooler stuff. I have 3 forms of Chimera here because Chimera does have 3 different builds, essentially. I don't have Pure in here because I think Pure is not that great at the current moment. I don't have Toy Box in here as well, but the deck has 3 very powerful forms, 2 now, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But I just think that being one of the people that really just represents Chimera here on YouTube, I really feel like I need to talk about the multiple powerful builds. Starting with the Branded Chimera, I don't think this really has much meta contention at this point. The Branded engine is kind of dead at this point. Branded Fusion going to 1 means that Branded as an engine cannot perform very well because at the end of the day, the Branded engine was already kind of in a status that you just had to see Branded Fusion or you really didn't see Branded at all in a deck. I have seen some Branded Chimera duelists trying to like slot in some Cartesias or more Branded openings to get to a Luber, which will then get you to the Branded Fusion, but nothing concrete that it's performing very well. Then we have the Chimera Melodious, which is like a budget form of the Fiendsmith engine. This version of the deck lost Appaloosa, which was one of its big end board pieces because it was always trying to end on Appaloosa plus the Vortex Dragon and plenty of other stuff. This deck, I still think, is pretty okay. Meta contender at the very least. If you can't afford your Fiendsmith stuff, this is certainly like up there. But I just think that having lost Appaloosa means you lost one of your major endboard pieces, but it still pumps out bodies like crazy, so you could probably slot in some other cool stuff. And then we have the deck that I've been playing for the last little while, and that is Fiendsmith Chimera. If you all watched my video last week, I made a video on the brand new build, which by the way is still in a work in progress. But this deck did lose Lacrima, it lost Beatrice, and it lost Appaloosa. 3 cards that were run in the original build that now have to be moved around. But this deck does a lot of cool stuff. I'm in the process of cooking up an interesting build that I will not be revealing until after my regional this weekend, so stay tuned for that next week. But this deck is very, very, very powerful in the current format now that a lot of decks are powered down in power level. The fact that it can get a hand rip off, set up Caesar, set up plenty of other stuff, and it has a lot of just unique interactions that are unique to the deck. It's not one of those decks that's just pumping out generic floodgates like, you know, Appaloosa or even Omni negates like Baron. So that being said, I'm still going to put it in meta contender. I'm not going to toot the deck's horn too loudly and say it's tier 1. I don't think it is up there that far, but I do think it is a very strong meta contender in the current format. So now I want to talk about the decks that also benefit from grass coming off the list. We've already talked about Branded, but we have Lightsworn, Tearlaments, and Infernoids. All three of these decks heavily benefit from grass coming off the list because you're milling a bunch of cards out of your deck and they want to do that. There are some hybrid builds of like Lightsworn Tear with grass, but we are just going to separate them as a whole. I still think Lightsworn is kind of dog water. I don't think the deck plays fast enough in the current format, even with grass is greener, to be able to compete in the current format. Infernoids, I would have to say, is rogue because it doesn't do a whole lot. There are builds I have seen where it's running like a Sinful Spoils package with grass is greener, but then they have to run like extra OSS, which is fine because they get to level 1 fires pretty easily thanks to Decatron. So the deck does some interesting stuff, I'll give it that, but I have to put it in the rogue category. As for Tearlament, I have seen an interesting build with Tearlament, Lightsworn, and like Luna Lights to have grass in the deck, and it looks pretty powerful. Not to mention just tier in general in this current format, if we're not even considering grass. If we're just considering the normal like 40-45 deck list with the Fiendsmith engine and like even the Horus package, this deck does a lot of cool stuff. There's a buddy at my locals that runs this deck with the Fiendsmith engine, not Horus engine, and he does a lot of stuff. He ends on like Totally Awesome plus a bajillion other cards. So the fact that this deck can also just access Totally Awesome on top of everything else is really strong because it's one of few decks that can also put up an Omni negate. So because of that, I have to put this in meta contender. It is very powerful. The problem is the deck dies to Shifter, and Shifter is very popular in the current format, which I will talk about very soon. Gimmick Puppets. I have Gimmick Puppet or Gimmick Puppet Horus. It kind of is the same deck, honestly. They lost 2 monsters on the ban list. They lost C40 and regular 40. But the OTK or the FTK is still very possible. So with Gimmick Puppet only being allowed to run 1 of each 40 monster, they are limited to what they can do with the FTKs. The FTK is very linear now, so it's a lot easier to stop, but the deck is substituting a lot of cards they were running for just more ways to get to the field spell, and the field spell is what lets them FTK with a 1-card combo. That being said, I think because the line is a lot more linear, it's a lot easier to stop, and because of that, I kind of have to put this in Rogue. I don't think that the deck is by any means dead, but its power level is heavily dropped because the variables in which that they could go into different lines if they were interrupted somehow and then still FTK you are pretty much eliminated at this point. Kashtira, I'm just going to put it in Rogue. I think Cash is a very strong deck. It runs Shifter, but overall, it's kind of getting left in the dust at the moment. I don't think it's doing a whole lot. I haven't seen it top in a while, mostly just being run as a package or an engine. It's, you know, running 3 Fenrir, 1 Unicorn, plus the Birth or, you know, whatever ratios you want to use. But overall, as a deck, Cash hasn't really been putting up a lot of results lately. Labyrinth. So I've been hearing a lot of hype about Labyrinth Fiendsmith, that there's this crazy line, there's a lot of cool stuff to do. I have yet to see Labyrinth perform in the last little while, and I think that's just because there's not a lot of representation. One would think that the Labyrinth cards can run really well with Fiendsmith because Fiendsmith can essentially just allow them to get to a lot of their stuff, having being Fiends. Eerie Leader can dump one of the furniture essentially, and then like if you have a way to remove a monster from the board with a card effect, then you know you can get the furniture back to your hand or summon it, which just lets you further generate more card advantage. But again, I haven't seen a lot and I don't know enough about Labyrinth to cook a lot, so I'm gonna have to put this in Rogue simply out of ignorance. I don't know what's going on with Labyrinth as of late. If you haven't noticed, there's going to be a lot of Rogue on this tier list, and another Rogue is going to be Ice Barrier. I have seen some interesting Ice Barrier hybrids, but Ice Barrier is essentially just a floodgate deck. It is a control deck. It's designed to just kind of lock you out of the game. It's doing a lot of cool stuff, but it dies to too much interruption. If you get hit with Nibiru before you can get Toad out, you're kind of just, you know, doing nothing. This deck is interesting. I have seen an interesting build with White Forest Runic where they summoned out Lancia on me, and then they used Lancia to summon General Tau, which is the one that you have to discard a card to resolve a monster effect on the board. So it's interesting. I think there is potential for like an Ice Barrier engine. Ice Barrier is also seeing success in the Sprite, obviously with Mirror Mage and the Chains, but as a deck, it's not doing a whole lot. Madolche, as much as it hurts me to say this, dog water. Madolche got a lot of good support in Infinite Forbidden. It's a deck that I was really looking forward to playing, and now that the support is out and I have played the support, it just can't keep up in the current format. Madolche, I think, is a deck that needs to have more than just the 2 normal summons, but it needs to have more cards that can extend if your normal summons are negated or popped off the board before you can do anything. The deck has a lot of ignition effects, which means that you can normal summon, and before you get the chance to even activate your card, they can get it off the field, or they can just pre-negate it. The deck does a lot of good stuff, and the support is really crazy. Being able to let Messenger Gelato resolve more than like 4 times if you wanted it to is very powerful, but again, a lot of it is an ignition effect, not trigger effects, which means there's a lot of openings for interruptions. And when we are in a format that is pretty much centered around getting interrupted, it's hard to compete. Not to mention Madolche always struggled going second, and the new support did not really change that. Melodious, I'm putting in meta contender. This deck is still very strong. It is just seeing a lot less representation as of late, but this deck's still doing a lot of good stuff. Very powerful, very high skill ceiling. This deck is good. I got nothing left to say about it because I haven't played the deck. I haven't really played against the deck. I just know that the deck is still strong. I've seen people do very well with the pure version of this deck. The problem is that it's, again, another deck that if it gets interrupted too many times, it might just have to pass. Memento. Honestly, I'm putting Pure and Fiendsmith up here. Both of them are very tier 1 contenders. There's a buddy at my locals who is playing Pure Memento, and he constantly is mopping the floor with us. This deck is strong. They do kind of have to scoop if they get hit with too much interruption. The wrong kind of interruption can just make them pass automatically, like Shifter. They are running a lot of one-ofs in the deck, a lot of one-of names, and it's a very strong deck regardless. If they have the right hand, they can blow through 2 to 3 types of interaction. They are able to, with the Fiendsmith package, set up Caesar, so that way Nib isn't a threat. They can set up Desiree with the Fiendsmith package, so that way board breakers like Dark Ruler and the Evenly Matched are no longer threats as well. And on top of that, a lot of their monsters aren't even like light or dark, so Bestials aren't like a huge threat to this deck. And then on top of that, the perk of this deck is that even if you like open Dark Ruler and it resolves, if they have the trap plus the combined creation, it's the traps effect that negates monster effects. It's not the combined creation. So you can't even negate like the combined creation, be safe from that. This deck dies to board breakers if the board breakers resolve properly, but Dark Ruler is not one of the ones that is like super good against this deck. Pearly, and as much as I love Pearly, I wish I could put it higher than this, but I have to put Pearly in Rogue. I have yet to see Pearly do like anything super impressive. It's a very good, cheap option, and I think that's something that Pearly has going for it, is that it is a cheap, strong deck. So the moment you buy this deck for like 20-30 bucks, you can just immediately jump into the format and have good competing viability. This deck is just kind of like a good deck to kind of bridge your way into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it is still a rogue strategy and it is cheap, which is something a lot of decks in the current format cannot say. Not to mention on top of that, the deck just kind of has like multiple builds. They have the Adventure build, they have the Fiendsmith build, the Board Breaker build, the Hand Trap build, but the Hand Trap build always seems to be the one that's reigning top, and that's simply because if you're going to be drawing 4 cards on your opponent's standby phase, you better have cards to draw that are going to be high impact, aka hand traps. So yeah, as much as it pains me to say it, I just think Pearly is in a rogue contending status. I don't think it can really compete with the top dogs all that much. Noir 5 material is still impressive, but it's at this point kind of easy to out. Next is Rescue Ace. This is like any Rescue Ace deck, Pure, Fiendsmith, Fire King, Sinful Spoils, any version of Rescue Ace, I have to put at the meta contender. This is a deck that is honestly still pretty much full power minus the 1 airlifter. the deck being able to just set 4 pass off of Turbulence is still a very powerful strategy, and being able to bridge from the Snake Eye package into Turbulence, basically Diabell Star, is just a 1-card combo for Rescue Ace is very, very strong. And honestly, I was preaching this before, but I would have thought that if the Snake Eye deck got butchered on this last ban list, like it honestly should have, Rescue Ace probably would have been the best deck again, because it just is essentially still full power. Next, we have Ritual Beasts, or Spiritual Beasts, whatever you want to call them. I gotta put these at tier 1. I am a man that will admit when I am wrong. In my last tier list video, I believe I said Ritual Beast was one of those decks that like was performing because we just didn't know how to interact with it, and then it was gonna kind of fizzle out. But this deck is still doing shit, so I'm clearly wrong. Ritual Beast just is able to do a lot. It is kind of the anti-meta card right now because it runs Dimension Shifter, it can run Dimension Fissure, I think it can even run Macrocosmos if it chooses to. I don't know if builds are, but the deck just kind of does shit, and it's really hard to interact with it because a lot of its monsters kind of bump themselves to the extra deck for cost, so it's hard to interact with them with any sort of target negation. That being said, if you do somehow find yourself against this and you are for some reason running like Artifact Lancea, they do just kind of scoop from there. They can't really play if they can't banish their cards, but this deck is just the best shifter deck in the format. This deck was designed to run shifter, at least until Malice comes out, but this deck just lives and breathes by the Dimension Shifter. And it is because of that that I kind of have to put it at tier 1. This is, like I said, the anti-meta deck. They are running Dimension Shifter. They're running a lot of cards that just banish, which is something that the format doesn't like, usually ever. Then we have Runic Stun. I don't got much to say about this. Runic Stun's still a meta contender. They lost 1 skill drain, but they just threw in other floodgates like the microorganism or whatever the card is called, the other floodgate. They run a bajillion floodgates. They're now just running like Amato Owado or whatever it's called. They're running Inspector Border. They're just running more floodgates, just different named floodgates. Honestly, if we wanted Runic Stun to get hit, we should have just put Tip to 1, and that would have probably been enough. Like Tip and Skill Drain to 1, and that would have been enough to hit the deck's consistency a little bit. Then we have Sprite. I'm not going to talk about Runic for higher Sprite anymore because it, at the current moment, isn't really putting up results. It's just not able to compete. But Pure Sprite, being able to set up Toad and a bunch of other shit like Red and Carrot, still strong. I'm going to put Sprite at Rogue, though. The problem with Sprite is that they set up very, very strong end boards, but they use almost all of their resources to do it. And because of that, they don't really have a grind game. So if you can break their board successfully, they probably aren't cracking back. Tenpai. So I lied. We have another deck up here in the best deck. I have to put Tenpai up here with Yubel because Tenpai in its current state is still fucking stupid. The deck lost 2 field spells and essentially lost Prosperity, which was like, in a sense, 2 more field spells because the Prosperity could find like Terraforming or the field spell. So the deck lost some consistency, but they're just running more hand traps, or they're running more ways to get to the field spell. So the deck, yes, did see an impact. The deck is a little less consistent now, but it is still insane. And I don't really know what else to say about Tenpai. Like, the deck is just still OTK go burr, Fire Dragon go burr. It's just a little bit more interactable now, because if they can't get to the field spell or they don't find the field spell, then you can still interact with their monsters and the main phase, meaning that it's not always guaranteed that they are going to get to the level 10 before the battle phase, which was usually the strategy before. Now, a deck that I didn't find myself talking about today, that here we are, Voiceless. Voiceless has really fallen off since it was released in Phantom Nightmare back in February. In just 7 short months, this deck went from one of the best decks in the room to an okay deck to non-existent, essentially, seeing no toppings whatsoever. And the reason for that being is that the deck does very good going first, but it doesn't really compete going second. That being said, the deck has a lot of room for non-engine. The deck does still set up one of the few Omni-Negates still left in the game that is an in-engine Omni-Negate, and on top of that, the deck still sets up very strong end boards. The deck can also still run the Melodious engine, which only further proves that it sets up very strong end boards. So the deck is still very strong, and honestly, a lot of people are saying this deck's going to make a comeback now that the power level has kind of decreased a little bit in this current format. I'll believe it when I see it, but out of just generosity, I will say this is going to be a meta contender once again. At the very least, you can still do very well with this deck at a regional level for sure, maybe not a YCS, but I could still see this deck doing very well. Very good pilots who know the deck inside and out can still pivot even to go second turn. So I think the deck still has some playability for sure. And then the last deck we are going to talk about today is White Forest Runic. White Forest hasn't done like a super whole lot upon release on Infinite Forbidden. It has seen a lot of play with the Centurions, with the Toy Box engine, with Runic, but it hasn't seen a whole lot. It is getting tops. I will admit that. It is getting tops, but it's not like the greatest. I think this deck's actually kind of insane now, kind of bonkers. With Snake Eyes kind of decreasing in the power level, if you hit Snake Eye Ash or Poplar off the top and they don't have a way to get to Oak, they just immediately kind of have to scoop, because if they can't get to their Oak to revive from the banish pile, they're hurting. That's always been kind of the perk towards Runic, is that if you are playing against a deck that needs their one-ofs and you just hit them off the top, they may just have to scoop from there. I'm going to have to put White Forest Runic in tier 1. This deck is kind of nutty. The recursion's insane. A very good pilot like Joshua Schmidt, or just a very good pilot in general, can navigate this deck very well. The interaction is very difficult as well, because the deck has just like a Book of Moon they can resolve twice, maybe 3 times in a turn, to prevent you from link summoning or synchro summoning, obviously not fusion summoning. So the deck is very strong. But that is all the decks I have for you guys today. If I missed a deck, then I didn't really feel like it was worth talking about. These are a lot of the decks you're going to be seeing in the current format, even though the current format is only going to last about another month until Rage of the Abyss comes out, and then Snake Eyes will once again reign supreme. I will also just give a spoiler that I think we will see a heavy spike in Chimera players once Azamita comes out. The Azamita raises the power level of Chimera heavily, being able to give the deck essentially an Omni Negate, which is just very powerful. But we will further talk about that format when Rage of the Abyss comes out. I want to thank you all for coming and watching this video today, guys. Don't forget to leave a like on the video, and also subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Leave a comment down below if I missed your deck, or if you want to talk about a certain deck, maybe talk about something I missed when I was talking about these current decks. But with that, I'll see you all in the next video. See ya.